First of all, I'd like to apologise for being late. I had some airplane delays this morning. And then I'd really like to thank the speakers, and I'm really pleased that I managed to be here for all 4 presentations, for such really interesting and informative presentations. What I'd like to do in 5 minutes, which is very difficult for an academic, is to just maybe make a comment or a question or something to think about from each paper, and then to think about some broader issues that we might want to draw from across the presentations. So firstly, Annabelle, thank you very much for your paper. I thought it really highlighted that we need to consider child protection and poverty reduction as very interrelated issues, and that really came across in how it was kind of helping your programmes. And I think one of the things that came across was that it's not just about linking poverty and child protection, but we need to think about the other related issues as well. We can't use poverty as a proxy for maltreatment. We need to consider other issues as well. And to think about, so maybe my comment then is to think about how we negotiate all these factors that result in issues of child marriage, for instance, in the case that you raised, and what do we, how do we respond to that? And then, Reinhardt, thank you very much as well for your paper. I thought there was some really interesting comments here about breaking perceptions that poverty is a rural phenomenon, and clearly it's not, and how space and distance are quite important in how we think about poverty. Urban areas often have much higher levels of violence and neglect, with no family support systems available to children who may have migrated with one relative or so into communities. And then I was really interested in the non-formal schooling that you highlighted in your talk, and how that can be really making a difference, and how we need to think about those programmes that are off the radar of larger NGOs. But also a cautionary note to maybe think about whether there are mechanisms for child protection within those environments as well. And Bekele, the cash transfer programme in Ethiopia, very interesting. And I was just wondering here, whether you had any thoughts on whether cash transfers, how that impacts on the children that it's meant to be addressing. Who cares for those children, and does the cash transfer change who might care for the children, in terms of very poor relatives being able to take in children where previously they might not have been, or maybe for less positive reasons where orphans are taken in, for instance, in order to access cash transfers. And then Andrea, a very fascinating programme that's taking place in Chile. I really admired the multi-agency approach that was taking place there. But I just wondered, to what extent are the very poor and the most vulnerable being accessed through this? What about mothers that don't go to prenatal checkups, for instance, because of fear of being on the radar, for instance? I think I've still got a couple of minutes, have I? Okay, right, sorry for all the paper shuffling. So I thought all the presentations really highlighted that poverty is an issue that needs to be addressed in relation to child protection, and that we need to make connections between anti-poverty agendas and child protection agendas. And I just wanted to draw out 3 areas where we might face some challenges in how we do this across different sectors, different countries, and different programmes. And the first one was about concepts. How do we define these terms? How do we define poverty? How do we define child protection? And the areas of child maltreatment that we're talking about, and then how does that affect the way that we develop strategies and solutions? For instance, I remember a number of years ago being part of a discussion in Ethiopia, interestingly, around Convention 182, from when Ethiopia ratified Convention 182 about the worst forms of child labour. And the discussion was around whether child sex work was labour or exploitation. And clearly there was an argument for classing it as labour in order for it to be covered within this convention for child protection reasons, but yet there was a strong argument for exploitation. And so we need to think about the concepts we're using and how we define them. And I think related to that is the point about language. And I think Reinhardt's presentation kind of helped me to think about this. You were talking about a lot of programmes that are off the radar, but clearly there's a lot of literature, reports that are off the radar because they're in non-English languages or non-European languages, for instance. And maybe that's something I'd urge the systematic review to consider as to how they incorporate Amharic literature, for instance, into their review. But also whose voices, and are we hearing children's voices in this process? And Annabelle helpfully had a number of children's voices, and it was really great to hear them coming through. Secondly, contexts, I think, is another area where we need to think about how we're building bridges between contextual understandings of maltreatment and poverty. At what scale should we be looking at these programmes? A very diverse range of programmes were offered to us, and can they all be scaled up or can they be translated to other contexts? And how do we define, for instance, early marriage across different contexts? And if I've got 30 seconds, I'll give you an example from my own research in Lesotho and Malawi, where we looked at young people's rural livelihoods, and early marriage came up as a livelihood strategy. For those girls in Lesotho, it came up as a very negative strategy, livelihood strategy. They were very unhappy. They may have been eloped or married off because of poverty within their families. Whereas in Malawi, 16, 17, 18-year-olds were very happy to have been married as a livelihood strategy, and they felt that it was lifting them out of poverty. They were in matrilineal environments, so they were staying with their maternal families as opposed to in Lesotho, where they had to move to their patrilineal families and maybe broken down social networks that they'd previously had. And so it's to think about how we think about those different contexts and how we define child maltreatment within those contexts. And then my very last challenge that I think that I want to put forward in terms of building bridges across child protection and child poverty is thinking through the sort of conceptual ideas that we might be presented with and how we might want to draw theoretically upon certain concepts when we're working practically on the ground. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of areas where I think it would be helpful to think about this, and that's around relationality and around mobility. We need to think of children as relational, as part of families, as part of communities. They're not living in isolated lives, and therefore strategies for child protection need to take those contexts into account. And for instance, Annabelle, you nicely highlighted how the assistance was really helping to delay marriage because it was assisting whole families and not just children. And similarly with Andrea's paper, your multi-agency approach was including families. It was important. And so family context of poverty is a very important one to look at in relation to maltreatment. And then lastly, mobility. We need to think about children on the move and families on the move in relation to how we deal with child protection and poverty-related issues. For instance, how do migrant children access the resources that are on offer to them? The domestic workers or sex workers, for instance, who are highly mobile, migrating into cities. Reinhardt talked about the migration into cities, and how do we involve those young people into our services? And so I think then there are a number of challenges for thinking through how we link child protection and poverty. but I do want to commend the panel today for some really interesting and really great presentations around what can be done. Thank you.